Siege warfare is inevitable because outnumbered forces are significantly more likely to be able to defend themselves from a fortified position. However, without appropriate supplies and weapons, both the military and the population are susceptible to starvation and disease. Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. In today's video, we are going to discuss the deadliest sieges in history. So, let's start our video. Siege of Ostend, 1601 to 1604. Present-day Belgium's Ostend was the site of one of the longest sieges in history and the fiercest combat of the 80 Years' War. Recent fortifications made Ostend an ideal location for defense, and the Dutch and English soldiers, led by General Francis Vere, were optimistic about their chances against Spain and Archduke Albrecht. The siege began on July 5, with the defenders eventually commanding up to 50,000 soldiers. The Spanish, on the other hand, had close to 80,000 men, most of whom were on foot. As the siege drew on, both sides resorted to increasingly nefarious tactics to hasten its conclusion. Albrecht nearly succeeded in persuading a traitor to help turn some of the more persuadable men against Vere, but his plot was discovered and he was forced to flee the city. Albrecht may have misunderstood Vere's intentions, but he was accused of dragging Spain into a sham peace discussion, from which he withdrew at the last minute. The Dutch and English armies surrendered after a long and violent siege on September 20, and Albrecht entered the city with his wife, Isabella, who cried upon seeing the carnage. Shortly thereafter, negotiations commenced, and a 12-year ceasefire was enacted. Siege of Baghdad, 1258. Unsurprisingly, a Mongol siege is included on the list. This time, the horde was led by Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis Khan, and it laid siege to the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. Khan sought to demolish one of Islam's most populous and well-known cities to eliminate what he thought to be the greatest threat to his reign. After Baghdad's caliph, al-Mustasim, refused to surrender, more than 100,000 Mongols attacked the city. Shiite Muslims, who were upset by Mustasim, assisted the Mongols. The siege commenced on January 29 and ended on February 10. Once the Mongols stormed the city, they indiscriminately killed everyone they saw, except Baghdad's Christians, whom Khan isolated in a church, or perhaps his wife. According to legend, Mustasim was folded into a carpet and trampled to death by a horse. Khan specifically targeted the House of Wisdom, one of the most famous intellectual centers of its period, for destruction. During the sacking, an incalculable amount of knowledge was lost as the Mongols threw practically every book in the city into the river. According to witnesses, the Tigris contained so many writings that a horse could walk across it. Siege of Sevastopol, 1854 to 1855. During the siege of Sevastopol, which occurred during the Crimean War, British, French, and Turkish troops faced off against the Russian army. The siege lasted 11 months and featured some of the earliest examples of trench warfare. It was a struggle for survival on both sides. As soon as the Russians recognized they could not overcome their opponents in open combat, they shifted the majority of their forces to the city and took up defensive positions. The conflict raged during the day for some time. Each night, the Russians would reinforce their positions after incurring damage from bombardment. Unfortunately for both the besiegers and the besieged, the winter was exceedingly hard, and cholera and dysentery killed many soldiers on both sides. Nearly all of the French army's casualties were attributable to the illnesses their soldiers got. The Russians were eventually forced to leave after successfully holding the castle, allowing the Allied forces to enter the city on September 9. The war concluded shortly thereafter. Several artists attempted to remember the siege, with Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, being the most well-known. Siege of Tenochtitlan, 1521. The Siege of Tenochtitlan was the final and decisive fight between the defending Aztecs and the Spanish army, which consisted nearly entirely of subjugated indigenous people. Hernán Cortés led his 200,000-man army against Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, intending to annihilate the Aztecs to seize their land and wealth for Spain. The number of defenders was approximately 300,000. However, the technological advantage of the Spanish army helped change the tide of combat in their favor. For a time, it appeared as though the Aztecs might prevail, but a smallpox epidemic seriously crippled their defensive capabilities. Realizing that a door-to-door invasion was impracticable, Cortés pounded the city with his cannons, demolishing practically every structure until the Aztecs capitulated. The siege itself lasted only 3 months, but it produced a huge number of deaths, particularly among the city's citizens, who may have accounted for half of all fatalities. Many think that Montezuma and the Aztecs believed that Cortés was the reincarnation of their god Quetzalcoatl. However, most experts believe that Montezuma and many of his advisors were fully aware that Cortés was merely a man. The Siege of Carthage, 149 to 146 BC. In one of their bloodiest wars, the Romans attacked Carthage, one of the most powerful towns in existence before the establishment of the Roman Empire. Assaulted in 3 different conflicts known collectively as the Punic Wars, the city remained autonomous until the Romans directly attacked Carthage during the Third Punic War. The Roman armies, led by Scipio Aemilianus, had more than 80,000 men. The Carthaginians had 90,000 soldiers and more than 400,000 civilians. Officially, the siege began when the Romans refused to accept Carthaginian capitulation, citing a list of conditions that were also rejected. Since they had previously surrendered their old arsenal to the Romans, the city immediately began producing new weapons, and they were able to repel the initial Roman assault. After a lengthy blockade, the Carthaginians unsuccessfully attempted to push back against their enemy. After 3 years, the Romans were finally able to penetrate the city, where they slaughtered and looted everything. All 50,000 surviving individuals were sold into slavery. The Romans razed every structure to the ground and then departed. There is also a legend that the Romans salted the earth around Carthage, but it is unlikely to be genuine given the lack of historical evidence and the fact that the idea originated in the 19th century. Siege of Jerusalem, 70 AD. After a Jewish revolt in 66 AD, the Romans determined to permanently subdue the population. Therefore, Titus Flavius was dispatched with 70,000 men to besiege the city, which was defended by roughly 40,000 warriors. Titus surrounded the city with 4 legions in February and dispatched the Jewish historian Josephus to negotiate with the city's defenders. Nonetheless, he was pierced by an arrow and the siege began. The Roman blockade steadily starved the city's inhabitants, who were forced to consume whatever they could find, including leather and excrement. Some individuals even resorted to cannibalism, with Josephus mentioning a mother who ate her child. Eventually, the Roman forces broke the wall via a clandestine, late-night assault and commenced massacring civilians as they marched through the city. Several structures were destroyed and pillaged, notably the Second Temple, which was demolished against Titus's instructions. Almost all of the remaining people were picked up and sold into slavery, while a huge proportion of them was simply executed in the streets. On September 7, the Romans took possession of the city. Siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944. During World War II, the Eastern Front endured one of the deadliest and longest sieges in history. The Siege of Leningrad, which pitted the German army against the Russian army, was nearly as damaging as the better-known Battle of Stalingrad. Beginning on September 8, 1941, the civilian population bore the brunt of the siege, as the German blockade effectively limited the amount of food that could enter the city. After the siege, the soldiers received only a quarter loaf of bread every day. However, the city persisted in the face of famine, and Russian defenders kept the German army at bay. During the winter, the neighboring waters of Lake Ladoga froze, allowing supplies to be carried into the city. This entrance also allowed for the evacuation of the sick and aged, earning it the moniker Road of Life. Eventually, Russian forces from the east forced the Germans back and broke the siege of Leningrad, much to the relief of the city's survivors. So, which do you think is the deadliest siege in history? Let us know in the comments section below.